I gave up everything after Gerald passed. The house we built together, the garden he used to trim every Sunday, even the porch swing where we sat through 4 decades of seasons. I packed it all into boxes and moved into my son Tobias's home, thinking love would wait for me there. But what I found wasn't comfort. It wasn't family. It was something colder. And the first sign didn't come from what they said, but from what they didn't. Have you ever stepped into a room and felt like your presence made the air thinner? That was day one, and it only got quieter from there. Tobias picked me up from the station. He was polite as always, but quieter than I remembered. We rode in silence most of the way. When I mentioned how much had changed since he moved out, he just nodded and kept driving. I chalked it up to nerves. We were all adjusting. Angela met us at the door. Her hair was pinned back perfectly, not a strand out of place. She gave me a quick smile, a hello, then turned and walked inside. I stepped in suitcase in hand and felt something shift. Not the air. Something else. Something less visible. The guest room had been prepared. Clean sheets, a folded towel, a small lamp. It looked ready, but not warm. Angela stood at the door as I unpacked. She mentioned the shared bathroom schedule, the way they usually handle groceries, and how she prefers quiet after 9. I nodded along, trying to be agreeable, trying not to take up too much space. Later that evening, I sat at the dining table while they finished dinner in front of the television. No one offered me a plate. I didn't ask. I went back to my room and opened a small wooden box Gerald had left me. Inside was a notebook blank except for the first page. His handwriting. Just 6 words. If you feel small, write it. I closed the box and placed it beside the bed. I hadn't expected much. Just a place to grieve. Maybe share a few stories. Maybe feel seen. But Angela's eyes avoided mine. Her sentences stopped just short of kindness. And Tobias. He watched her more than me. There was something familiar in that silence, a memory, long before the wedding. A day Angela sat across from me in a cafe and smiled too tightly. A moment I had once dismissed. Now I wondered if that moment had never truly passed. Maybe it had just been waiting. Quiet. Like a storm held behind glass. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Not calm, just quiet. I would wake early before either of them stirred and make coffee. I drank it alone by the window, watching the neighbour's dog chase shadows across the lawn. The house was still. The kind of still that doesn't come from peace, but absence. I offered to cook, not every night, just enough to feel useful. I made pot roast one evening, left it warming in the oven, and set the table for 3. When Tobias came home, he gave me a smile, then turned toward the living room without a word. Angela followed, phone in hand, eyes never lifting. I sat at the table by myself. The plates stayed empty. I placed foil over the leftovers and tucked them into the fridge. No one asked about dinner. No one mentioned it the next day. This happened again and again. Lasagna, chicken soup, meatloaf. Always enough for everyone. Always uneaten. Eventually I stopped using the big dishes. I cooked just enough for one and saved the rest without asking. Tobias said he was busy with work. Angela said she wasn't hungry. But the food went untouched even when I wasn't in the room. That was the part that sat heavy. Not that they refused what I offered, but that it didn't matter I had offered at all. One afternoon I found the dog, Juju, standing outside my door. Tobias had loved that dog, slept with her as a boy, carried her picture in his wallet when she was just a puppy. But when she saw me, her tail didn't wag. She growled, low, sharp, and steady. I froze. She didn't bark, just stared like she didn't recognize me. or maybe like she did and didn't like what I'd become. I stepped back, closed the door gently, and waited for her footsteps to fade. That evening, I pulled out Gerald's notebook, the one with the 6 words on the front page. I turned to a fresh one and started writing. Tobias didn't say goodnight. Angela's shoes were still wet when she walked past the rug. The roast is in the fridge. Juju won't come near me. The next day, I kept writing. Small things. The sound of the back door closing when I was mid-sentence. The TV turning louder when I walked into the room. The way Angela always touched her belly now as if guarding something. They weren't cruel, not in ways most people would notice. But each day, the walls pressed in a little more, and I was learning how to feel them. In silence, in soup that stayed hot too long, in the notebook Gerald left behind. It was a Thursday, the kind of dull grey day that doesn't bother making promises. I had spent the morning folding laundry, not out of obligation, just habit. My hands needed something to do. Tobias had gone to work. Angela stayed in the bedroom, the door closed all day. That evening I made soup. Potato and leek, Gerald's favourite. I added just enough salt, stirred it slow, let it thicken the way he liked. I set one bowl on the table and left the rest on the stove. Tobias walked in around 7. He barely glanced at the pot. Angela followed soon after, rubbing her belly and sighing like the weight of the world sat just beneath her ribs. I stayed quiet. I knew the rhythm. The quiet was safer. But that night something shifted. Angela stood by the fridge, opened it, stared, then turned around. She didn't look at me when she spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, but the words sliced clean. If it weren't for your pension, we wouldn't even need you here. Tobias didn't flinch. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look surprised. He just leaned against the counter and started scrolling on his phone. The room went still, the kind of still that doesn't leave space for air. My hand stayed on the spoon, but I didn't stir. The soup had gone quiet, too. Angela left the kitchen. Her footsteps didn't echo. Tobias followed a minute later as if nothing had been said. I stood there for a while. The bowl on the table steamed gently untouched. I sat down across from it. The chair felt harder than usual, the silence heavier. I lifted the spoon, took a bite. The taste was fine, the temperature right. But the warmth didn't reach me. That night I didn't write in Gerald's notebook. I didn't need to. The words had already etched themselves in too deep. They didn't need ink. They stayed in the air, in the fabric of the cushion beneath me, in the spoon resting inside that half-full bowl. I washed the dishes slowly, careful not to make a sound. I dried them all and stacked them just so. I turned off the kitchen light last, letting the shadows return to their places. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the box where I kept the notebook. I didn't open it. I just sat. Not angry, not sad, just emptied out. The kind of hollow that comes when someone speaks aloud what you had been trying not to believe. I pulled the blanket over my legs, listened to the hum of the house, and I wondered when the last time was that my son had looked at me and truly seen me. It must have been years, maybe more. The soup bowl was still warm when they left the kitchen, but by the time I closed my eyes, the cold had settled in. And this time it wasn't just the air. Angela made the announcement over breakfast. She stood by the sink, a cup of tea in one hand, the other resting on her stomach like she was shielding it. She said the baby would need a nursery soon. She said space was tight. She said it kindly, as if the words didn't bruise on the way out. The decision had already been made. I would move into the garage. Tobias didn't say a word. He just sipped his coffee and kept his eyes on the window. No one asked how I felt about it. No one paused to pretend. They cleared the room that afternoon. My suitcase, the box, Gerald left a single chair from the back patio. Tobias carried the mattress down without looking at me. Angela stayed upstairs. The garage smelled of oil and damp concrete. A narrow window near the ceiling let in a sliver of light, but not warmth. They had placed a small space heater near the corner. The cord barely reached. There were no curtains, no closet, just a bare bulb and the faint hum of the water heater in the corner. I didn't complain. I didn't unpack either. I sat on the mattress for a long time, the cold seeping through the fabric. There was a spider's web in the far corner. I watched it sway, even though there was no breeze. Later that night, I found a plastic tub labeled Tobias, childhood. I hadn't seen it in years. I opened the lid and sifted through old report cards, drawings, a faded baseball cap. At the bottom, folded carefully, was a piece of construction paper. A card, his handwriting clumsy and wide. It said, "I miss you when you go to work. I love you, Mum." I held it longer than I meant to. The paper was soft at the edges, like it had been opened many times. I remembered the morning he gave it to me. I had packed him a peanut butter sandwich and kissed the top of his head. He cried when I left for the diner. Now he walked past the garage without pausing. That night I made a bed with the extra blanket I had brought. I wore 2 sweaters and socks, thick enough to muffle my steps. Juju didn't follow me down. She used to curl at my feet when Tobias was a boy. Now she waited upstairs near Angela. I tried not to think of it as exile. I tried to call it adjustment, a transition, a gesture for the baby's future. But deep down I knew it wasn't just about space. It was about erasing the parts of the house where I still existed, reducing my presence to a single bulb, a cold floor, and the weight of memories packed in a plastic tub. I turned off the light and lay back, the silence stretching wide. I had become a guest in the place I once called family, and even guests are allowed a little warmth. But that night the cold didn't move. It stayed, just like me. The cold in the garage never quite left my bones. Each morning felt like climbing out of a river. I layered sweaters, drank hot tea before bed, wrapped my feet in towels. But nothing stayed warm for long. I started coughing in short bursts, dry and shallow at first. Then came the fever. It was low, like a match held too far from the flame, but steady. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I wanted to be strong, but because I knew no one would ask. The silence had grown too familiar. By the 3rd night, I couldn't catch my breath without effort. The cough came in waves now, pulling something sharp from inside. I sat on the edge of the mattress, rocking gently, trying not to wake anyone. The garage light buzzed overhead. I didn't turn it on. When the dizziness hit, I knew I couldn't wait. I grabbed my coat and slipped out the side door. My phone barely held a charge, but it lasted long enough to call emergency services. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't leave a note. The ambulance ride was quiet. No siren, just the hum of tires and the beep of a monitor. The paramedic touched my shoulder once gently, and that simple gesture nearly brought me to tears. The doctor called it a mild case of pneumonia, triggered by exposure to cold, lack of ventilation. He asked where I had been sleeping. I gave him the address, but not the room. I stayed in the hospital for 2 nights. A nurse brought me broth and extra blankets. No visitors came. Not Tobias, not Angela. On the morning of my discharge, Tobias showed up. He brought a plastic bag with toothpaste, a hairbrush, and one of my cardigans. He stood by the window while I got dressed. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't say much at all. The ride home was silent. When we pulled into the driveway, he handed me the bag and walked back inside before I reached the door. The garage felt colder than I remembered. That night I didn't try to warm the space. I didn't boil tea or rearrange the blankets. I just lay on the mattress, staring at the ceiling, counting the creaks of the pipes. Juju didn't come down. The plastic tub with Tobias's childhood things still sat in the corner. I didn't open it this time. I didn't need to. The boy who had once cried at the thought of me leaving had become a man who barely noticed when I returned. I closed my eyes and told myself I was still here, not because they needed me, but because I had not yet finished remembering who I was. I left the hospital more tired than when I'd arrived. My body moved slower. My breath came shallower. But more than that, something inside me had gone quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a decision you haven't spoken yet, but already made. I didn't go straight back to the house. Tobias had driven ahead, assuming I would follow. I didn't. I walked instead. The air was crisp, not yet winter, but no longer fall. I passed 2 blocks, then 3, until I saw the faded awning of a diner I hadn't noticed before. The window was fogged from the inside. The sign on the door said open. I stepped in. The place smelled like old coffee and butter. 2 men sat at the counter. A woman near the window was scribbling in a crossword. No one looked up when I entered. I found a booth in the back. The vinyl seat cracked a little as I sat. I ordered tea with honey and toast. When the waitress returned, I thanked her. She smiled, the kind that sits in the eyes more than the mouth. It wasn't the tea that kept me there. It was the quiet. A different kind of quiet than the one in the garage. This one didn't shrink me. 10 minutes passed, then 20. And that's when I saw her. Marlene. She walked in with a newspaper tucked under her arm and a scarf that still carried the color she loved back in our restaurant days. She didn't see me at first, but when our eyes met, her face broke wide with recognition. She slid into the booth like we'd spoken just yesterday. We hadn't seen each other in almost 15 years. She didn't ask why I looked tired or where I had come from. She just started talking about the cold snap, about the tea being better here than most places, about the crossword lady who always came in on Thursdays. It took me 20 minutes to say anything real, and even then it wasn't much. Just that things had been hard lately, that I was staying with Tobias, that it hadn't turned out the way I hoped. Marlene didn't need more. She reached into her bag and handed me a small card. Plain, cream-colored, just a name and a number. Daniel Price, Elder Law and Family Advocacy. She told me he was good, quiet but sharp, the kind who knew when to listen and when to move. I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but I held it like something warm, like a match before it's lit. We sat a while longer, no rush. When we stood to leave, she hugged me, the kind of hug that stays in your coat long after you've walked away. Outside, the wind had picked up. I placed the card in my pocket and turned back toward the road. This time, I didn't hurry. I checked into a motel on the edge of town. Nothing fancy. A single bed, thin walls, a heater that rattled when it worked. But it was warm, and it was mine. I unpacked only what I needed. A change of clothes, my toothbrush, Gerald's notebook. The card from Marlene sat on the nightstand. I hadn't called yet. I wasn't ready for legal conversations or questions with long words. I needed something else first. Something slower. Something only I could do. That evening I sat at the little desk by the window with a ballpoint pen and an empty notebook I bought from the gas station nearby. I opened it. The first page stared back, blank and expectant. I wrote the date in the top right corner. Then I began. I started with the soup, not the words Angela said, not yet. Just the soup. The warmth that never made it to my chest. The way the steam curled and disappeared while no one noticed I was still sitting there. The metal spoon in my hand that felt heavier than it should have. Then I wrote about Juju, her growl, the way she backed away from me like I'd become someone else, or no one at all. I wrote about the bologna sandwich I left on the counter and found in the trash, the chair I moved back into place that someone quietly shifted again, the sound of Tobias's footsteps growing quieter with each passing day. I didn't cry while I wrote. The tears had already dried somewhere between the first ignored dinner and the night in the garage. This wasn't grief. It was documentation, a quiet claim to truth. I remembered Gerald's handwriting in the old notebook. If you feel small, write it. So I wrote. I wrote about the temperature in the garage and how it bit through 3 layers of clothing. I wrote about the fever, the ambulance, the hospital sheets that smelled like bleach and faint lemon. I wrote that no one asked if I was coming back, not even Tobias. I filled 5 pages in one sitting. My hand ached by the end, but it felt good. Not pleasant, but right. Each word laid a brick. Each sentence rebuilt something that had been chipped away. By the 3rd day, I had 20 pages, dates, details. The way Angela's voice changed when she spoke to me compared to others. The things Tobias didn't say and the ones he did all carved into silence. I didn't write to accuse, I wrote to remember. Because memory is a kind of evidence, because stories disappear when no one tells them. On the 7th page, I stopped writing mid-sentence and stared out the window. The motel sign flickered. Someone below shouted about a football score. But inside the room, it was still. Not empty, just still. I picked up the card from Marlene, turned it over in my hand. I wasn't ready yet. But I was getting there, one sentence at a time. I called Daniel Price the following morning. His voice was steady and calm, no rush, no judgment. He offered to meet that same afternoon. His office was 3 blocks from the motel above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and flour. I sat in the waiting room with my coat zipped to the chin, notebook tucked in my arms like something sacred. When I walked into his office, he didn't ask for a story. He asked for facts. I handed him the notebook. He read quietly, flipping each page with the care of someone handling something fragile. Every so often he nodded. He didn't interrupt. He didn't fill the room with legalese or sympathy, just space. After 20 minutes, he closed the book and folded his hands. The house, he said, was still partly mine. The deed still listed me as a co-owner. Tobias had never filed a change in title. Any financial moves made with the assumption of full ownership were not just morally wrong, they were potentially illegal. Daniel asked if I had seen any account changes. I said I hadn't checked in months. Gerald used to handle that, and I never felt the need to hover. But now I told him I wanted to see everything. Every statement, every withdrawal. He walked me through what he could gather from public records. Tobias had redirected part of my pension into the joint account. Legally questionable. Especially since I had not given written consent. More so because I wasn't using any of those funds myself. Daniel laid out my rights. Quietly, firmly. I still had standing. I hadn't been erased, only pushed aside. That mattered. He suggested a certified letter. A formal warning. A chance for Tobias and Angela to respond before legal action. Not a threat. A statement of boundary. A line they could no longer step over unnoticed. I agreed. Daniel asked for copies of documents I still had. I promised to bring them. Before I left, he said something that stayed with me. Truth doesn't shout. It writes itself down and waits. Back at the motel, I opened the notebook again. I added more. The days I went without speaking to anyone. The bills that arrived in my name but never reached my hands. The way Angela looked past me like I was already gone. I wasn't planning revenge. I didn't want a fight. I wanted recognition. I wanted the version of me they had buried under convenience and silence to stand back up. That night I slept better. Not deeply, but without dread. For the first time in weeks, I dreamed of something other than stairs and silence. I dreamed of a kitchen, mine, filled with sunlight, a pot simmering on the stove, and me standing at the counter writing something down. Not a list, not a record, a recipe, my own. The certified letter was delivered on a Tuesday. Daniel confirmed receipt. The next morning, Angela called Tobias home from work. She waited until he stepped through the door, then began pacing the kitchen with the letter in her hand, waving it like it was on fire. From what I heard later, she didn't deny what they had done. She called it a misunderstanding. She said it was family money, that I would have passed it down eventually, but the edge in her voice betrayed something sharper, something unraveling. That evening, I returned briefly to gather more documents from a locked box in my closet. The garage door was open. Light spilled out from the side window. Tobias's truck was in the driveway. Angela was in the living room speaking too loud for that small house. Her tone was sweet at first, full of sugar and guilt, but her words curled with urgency. She kept saying things like, "It's nothing serious, and it's just paperwork, and your mother's confused." I waited just outside the doorway. I didn't intend to eavesdrop. But I stood still when her tone shifted. She lowered her voice then, but not enough. "If she signs everything over, we can finally have the house. Ours. No more waiting around." Tobias didn't answer immediately. I could feel the silence stretching through the wall like tension in a wire. Then he asked something quiet, something I couldn't make out. Angela responded fast, her voice bright and brittle. "She'll sign. She always does. She's soft. You know that." That moment held me still. I stepped back down the driveway without a sound. I didn't need to hear more. I didn't need apologies or explanations. I had already written the truth. And now I had heard theirs. Daniel called me the next morning. He had received an angry voicemail from Angela, thinly veiled threats about lawyers and countersuits. He wasn't concerned. He told me their panic was revealing more than any defense they could build. I spent that day in the motel reorganizing papers and rereading the notebook, not to dwell, but to prepare. I added the overheard conversation word for word. I noted Tobias's silence again, and Angela's assurance that I would bend as I always had. But something had changed. Not just in them. In me. Tobias had once stood in front of a refrigerator with crayon drawings taped to the door and told me he loved me more than pancakes. Now he stood by while his wife carved out my worth with a pen and a plan. That night I didn't dream. I stared at the ceiling arms crossed over my chest, and I let the truth settle where grief used to sit. They wanted me gone quietly, but I had found my voice in ink, and I was not going quietly. The motel hallway was quiet when I heard the knock. It wasn't sharp or hurried, just one soft thud, then silence. I opened the door and found Tobias standing there, coat unzipped, hands in his pockets. His eyes were swollen like he hadn't slept much. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood in the threshold like a boy who forgot his lines. I stepped aside and he entered without a word. The room felt smaller with him inside. He didn't sit, didn't look around, just stood facing the window as if gathering courage from the streetlight. I didn't speak first. The quiet was mine now, and I wanted to see what he would do with it. He finally turned and said he saw the letter, that he read the notes Daniel had included, that he heard what Angela said. Then he stopped. Not to apologize, not to explain, just to let it hang in the air like something that used to be a rope, but now was only a thread. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the folder beside me. Inside were copies of the deed bank statements and a list of the pension deposits rerouted without consent. I told him everything was traceable. Every decision left fingerprints. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking barely. He said he hadn't known everything, that Angela had handled most of it, that he thought it was temporary, that they were just trying to prepare for the baby. I didn't ask what kind of child needed a house built on silence. I told him Daniel would move forward, that we weren't just drawing a line, we were redrawing the map. He nodded, slowly, like someone learning to accept a sentence rather than fight it. I told him I never stopped seeing him as my son, even when he stopped acting like it. That memory can be both a wound and a compass. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. A snapshot from years ago. Gerald in the background. Tobias with frosting on his nose, and me holding the cake, laughing. He handed it to me and said nothing. I placed it on the nightstand. Then I said something I hadn't planned to. You don't owe me love, but you owe me the truth. And your silence paid no debt. He didn't stay long after that. Just stood a moment longer, then nodded and left the door closing soft behind him. I didn't cry. I looked at the photograph, its edges curling with time, and thought about the woman in that picture. She still lived in me, not in the garage, not in the margin of someone else's budget, but here, in a room with her name on the reservation, and a lock on the door. Daniel sent the final letter on a Monday. It outlined everything with precise, measured language: misuse of funds, breach of agreement, intent to pursue formal division of property unless immediate steps were taken to correct the financial manipulation. It wasn't aggressive. It was clear. 3 days later, Angela called a meeting. Not a conversation. A performance. She insisted it happen at the house. Tobias would be there. She wanted to look me in the eye. I arrived just after noon. The living room looked exactly as I had left it, except colder. Tobias sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees. Angela stood by the fireplace, arms folded. Her expression was tight, not angry, just ready for war. She started talking before I even sat down. She said I had misread the situation, that I was blowing things out of proportion, that families didn't involve lawyers, that what I was doing was disrespectful and ungrateful after everything they had done to accommodate me. She called it accommodating. She said she had welcomed me, had cooked for me, had shared her home. She didn't mention the garage, or the soup, or the silence that swallowed every room I entered. I let her speak. Every word carved her outline sharper. I didn't interrupt. I didn't flinch. When she paused, waiting for a reaction, I handed her a copy of the financial report Daniel had prepared. A full timeline. Each transfer. Each discrepancy. I didn't need to explain it. She flipped through the pages, then slammed them on the coffee table. Tobias shifted beside her, but still said nothing. Angela turned to him. She asked if he was really going to let me do this, if he was going to watch his mother tear their family apart. He didn't answer. She demanded he say something. He stood up, looked at her, then at me. His voice was low, the kind people use when they're afraid of what will happen if they speak too loud. She's not tearing anything apart. She's just refusing to disappear. Angela went quiet, not because she had nothing left to say, but because she understood in that moment she had already lost. She left the room. Tobias didn't follow. I stood up, placed the photograph he gave me back on the table, and walked out. No shouting, no accusations, just a door closing behind me. One I would never need to open again. I moved out the following week. Not in secret, not in shame. I signed the lease on a small one-bedroom apartment above an old florist's shop that hadn't seen real business in years. The landlord was kind. She reminded me of someone I couldn't quite place. Maybe the version of myself that had once believed silence was safer than truth. I unpacked slowly. A few framed photos, Gerald's notebook, a chipped blue mug that somehow survived every move, and the copy of the letter Daniel had sent. I didn't hang it up, but I didn't hide it either. Marlene came by the day after I settled in. She brought cinnamon rolls wrapped in wax paper and asked how I felt. I told her I wasn't sure. She said that meant I was healing. She had a friend who was closing her deli in the North End. The lease was short and cheap, nothing fancy. But the equipment worked, and the space was clean. Marlene thought we could open something simple. Soup, bread, coffee. A place for women like us. People who had carried too much. People who had been made to feel like guests in their own lives. We called it Second Table. The first morning I arrived at 6, turned the key, lit the burners. Marlene baked in the back while I filled the chalkboard menu. Lentil stew, chicken and rice, split pea with ham. Around 9, Tobias came in. He didn't say much, just stood near the door, holding Juju in his arms. The dog wagged her tail when she saw me. She licked my hand and nudged her head under my arm. He handed me the leash and said she still remembered. He didn't ask to stay. He just nodded and left. I watched him go without bitterness. Sometimes people don't return the way we want, but they do return. That night, after we locked up, I placed a sign in the window. It read, "If you remember the taste of home, you're always welcome at our table." If this story touched something in you, I hope you carry it gently. Maybe you've been silenced in your own home. Maybe you've learned that dignity doesn't need noise. If you've ever been made to feel invisible, know this: your story matters. You matter. Let me know if you've ever found your own second table, the place where you remembered who you were. And if you're still searching for it, stay a while. You might just be closer than you think.